Good morning. We have here with us Ashish. We're very lucky. I'm going to introduce him. Back in the 70s, Ashish, when he was a student, participated with other fellow students in the defense of the Delhi's rich forest. In this process, they founded an environmental NGO called Kalpa Bricks, that together with Ashish has not stopped working on environmental and development issues. Ashish has taught at the Indian Institute of Public Administration, has served at the Greenpeace International Board, and coordinated India's National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. Ashish has also authored over 30 books, and is co-author of the great book, Charting the Earth, The Making of Global India, which is a critique of India's development strategy, where he argues for radical ecological democracy, as I'm sure he's going to explain now. Ashish is currently coordinating the Vikalp Sangam, or Alternatives Confluence process, which provides forum for organizations and individuals working on development alternatives across India and to come together. So we welcome Ashish. We're really happy to have you here so you can present all this work to us, as well as your analysis on how we can build these very necessary alliances between different worldviews that are emerging in the global south as well as in the global north. So Ashish is going to present for a bit less than an hour, I think, and then we're going to have plenty of time for debate, comments, and questions.
Thank you. Namaste. Well, first I'd like to start, as have all the other plenary presenters also, to give my heartfelt thanks to the organizers, the very generous hospitality of our Hungarian hosts, and everybody who's been feeding us, everybody who's been keeping all the rooms clean, the bathrooms clean, etc., etc., etc. So many, many thanks to all of them. Okay, I think for all of us, food is really important. And so my presentation is going to focus a lot on food in metaphoric ways and also in real life. What do we have today? In the presentation that I have, and hopefully it'll be less than an hour, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the loss of appetite, looking at the bad news, what's going wrong with growth and development. Clive and Barbara have already done brilliant jobs in deconstructing growth and development and sort of demolishing the myths that they present to us. So I don't think I need to spend more than a few minutes on this, and maybe present a little bit of what's happening in India. I'd like to spend much more time on the appetizer, which is looking at alternative initiatives that are actually happening at the grassroots, mostly in my experience from India, but also mentioning a few from other parts of the world. Then get to the main dish, which is looking at what are the sort of frameworks that are emerging from these initiatives towards a fundamental transformation of society. And again, that builds on what Clive and Barbara have already spoken about. Maybe a little bit of coffee time for reflecting on some key questions that arise in the search for alternatives. And then finally, a little bit of dessert on some interesting confluences that are happening, and one that I would like to propose. So, if you look at our dominant vision of development, for me, what comes to mind immediately is violence. It's violence against the rest of nature, as you can see in that advertisement on the top left-hand side. It's violence against communities, violence against cultures, and so on and so forth. Again, I don't think I need to go into it in detail, but when we go to a doctor and he or she says there's some growth in your cells, you get panicky, right? You get alarmed. When you go to an economist and say there's growth, like, oh, jumping up and down, all excited. But if you look at it, economic growth is like cancer for the planet. And we're actually creating huge numbers. Probably the majority of the world's population are becoming nowhere people in many different ways, not just in terms of physical living, but also in intellectual and spiritual and cultural ways. This is a process that's happening very rapidly in India. The people are being displaced and dispossessed all the time. And what we're actually looking at is a fundamental clash of civilizations also. This is Salim Bhai. He's a nomadic pastoralist in western India, in Kutch. And he told me a very interesting story. That vehicle that you see on the right-hand side is labeled as the world's cheapest car. It's a nano car that the Tata Corporation created a few years back, and it's supposed to have then been 100,000 rupees, which is 1,500 euros approximately, so really a cheap car. So Salim Bhai told me that, okay, that's worth 100,000 rupees. My Buffalo is worth 300,000 rupees. When you finish with the Nano in 10 years or 12 years and you junk it in the market, you'll get maybe 500 rupees or 1,000 rupees. By that time, my Nano, which is my Buffalo, would have created 10 more Buffalo Nanos, which means that much more worth. And yet, when the government provides land, virtually free of cost, they provide it to the Tata Nano. When we ask for land rights for our buffaloes and our livelihoods, we don't get it. So it's a very interesting sort of clash of civilizations. What we're seeing across the world is for hundreds of millions of people, a transition, a forced transition from livelihoods, which were a way of life, which were a culture, which were everything in life, to jobs. So what were ways of life have now become jobs that we do from 9 to 5, and we wait desperately for the end of the day, and we wait for the weekend, and we wait for vacations, and we heave a sigh of relief. And in that sense, the violence against the rest of nature, the violence against communities and cultures is also violence against us as individuals in our personal lives. And so I categorize that as a transition from livelihoods to deadlihoods. Whether we're in the traditional sector, where livelihoods are being destroyed, or in the modern sector, where we have deadening lives. And in India, for instance, there's a huge transition, not a huge, but I mean there's a increasing transition of IT professionals, for instance, dropping their jobs and wanting to go back and do some farming. That's really an expression of how people are beginning to understand that these are deadlihoods. It's a process that also, of course, creates huge inequalities. This is something you're all familiar with. In India, the recent survey that was done suggested that 1% of India owns more than 50% of its wealth. And many of you probably know this building, which I think is the world's largest single family building. One family owns a house of 27 stories. That's one of India's richest men, with I think India's richest corporation, Reliance. And if all of this was not enough, if ecological unsustainability and so on was not enough, if there was an argument that people give that you have to destroy the environment in order to raise people above the poverty line, etc., well, we're getting more and more evidence that that is also not happening. So this is just 3 days back, a study which is from official sources suggesting that people in villages in India are actually eating less nutritionally and food and quantity wise than they were 40 years back on average. It doesn't spare people in cities either, so we have air pollution killing 500,000 people every year. Again, a very recent study that was published just a couple of months back. And finally, as I mentioned in yesterday evening's panel, India along with China is also now becoming the new colonizer. Obviously, if it has this kind of a growth pattern and these growth aspirations, it cannot do it on its own resources. It has to then start seeking colonies outside India, countries that are peoples that are weaker than itself. For instance, 500,000 hectares in Ethiopia taken over by Indian corporations. And increasingly where what Gandhi said many decades back is beginning to come true, that if India were to take Britain's path of development, it will strip the world bare like locusts. Of course, you folks have already done it to a very good extent, but we are following in your footsteps. I mean, I don't mean these people, you people in the room, but essentially Europe and US and Japan have already kind of, been pioneers, and we're following suit. But can you imagine 2.5 billion people trying to live the same American standards of life, what that does to the planet? So that's the bad news. I don't want to go too much into detail about it. I don't think we need to. The question is, are there alternatives to all of this? We're all faced with this, with what we are told, the Tina syndrome. There is no alternative. And it seems to me that that's also a myth, and that there are. But then when we ask this question, we also have to ask the question, alternatives to what? And I think, again, following on from building on what Clive and Barbara already spoke about, we're talking about alternatives to the concentration of power. That could be the concentration of power in the hands of the market, corporations, concentration in the hands of the state, concentration in the hands of men, concentration in the hands of, in the Indian case, so-called upper castes, race concentration, ethnicities. There are many different ways. Age, you can think of all kinds of different ways in which power gets concentrated in the hands of a few to dominate the rest. So if that's the kind of, if those are the structural forces that we're actually talking about needing alternatives to, clearly the kind of solutions that are being offered to us, and again this has already been spoken about, are either very partial at best, or they're false solutions leading us down the wrong path, and that includes everything that's up there on the slide. End of bad news. Let's look at what are the transformative alternatives. To me, resistance to this mainstream course of development and growth and state domination, market domination, etc., is of course very much part of the alternative. In India, one of the terms that's used is satyagraha, which is in a sense speaking truth to power. Very recently, just 2 or 3 years back, the Intelligence Bureau of the Ministry of Home Affairs in India brought out a report about how Indian civil society and movements were actually damaging India's growth story. And according to them, we were causing a 2 to 3% GDP loss per year. That's great news. Some of my NGO friends were really disturbed and saying, no, how can they say that? And I said, that's good. So resistance is very much part of it, and of course also along with this, with the resistance you get assertions of self-determination, of ancient ways of living that people want to continue living, or the recognition of the unrecognized, whether it's unrecognized rights, it's unrecognized contributions to society, it's unrecognized labor, and so on and so forth. This is the iconic fight of the Dongriya Kond Adivasi indigenous people in eastern India against the United Kingdom Vedanta Corporation and the Indian state, which so far at least has been won by the indigenous people to stop mining in the hills that you can see there. And there are many, many, many like this. But along with this, given the fact that there are significant levels of deprivation from basic needs, in India, according to us, at least 70% of the population still is deprived from some basic need or the other, because of various reasons, including development itself, we have the need for initiatives on well-being across a whole range of sectors. And I'm going to give a few examples of these from just a few. I'm going to give maybe a handful of them from the thousands that actually exist in India along all these different fronts. And then of course we also have across the world. How many of you do yoga? All right, so if you feel uncomfortable with this map, you can do a headstand and you'll feel comfortable again. I like using this because it's a nice cultural shock. It wakes us up from the sort of colonial hegemony of even mapping that we have been facing. But so There's all kinds of alternatives coming up around the world. Country in Aboriginal Australia, Ubuntu and many other variants in various parts of Africa, Bougainvillea and other variants in South America, ecofeminism. I don't mean to say it's only North America, it's across many different parts of the world. The Kurdish territories, the eco-socialism, solidarity economy in this part of the world, biocivilization, Brazil, agroecology, permaculture in again many parts of the world, Kyosai in Japan, Zapatistas in Mexico, very inspiring. The commons, many people here. Did I forget something? Yeah, I think so. Are people familiar with degrowth? Yes. Okay. What I'm going to present is a few examples of what's happening in India, which are really inspiring grassroots examples of some alternatives that people are coming up with. Let's take food again. This is an organization comprised of Dalit women small-scale farmers. Now, Dalits are the so-called outcasts of India, the most oppressed social section. So, if you look at it, Dalit women small farmers, they're triple marginalized peoples. In the last 30 years, these women have organized themselves as collectives called sanghas. They've revived a lot of their traditional agricultural diversity. They've thrown out chemical farming. They've brought back organic, biologically diverse farming. They've created grain banks in all the villages that they live in. They've created links with producers, and so on. One of the most interesting things, and of course also fought for land rights for women, which is a very unusual thing in India. Most land is titled to men, but they have fought for and secured land rights for women. One very interesting thing they've done is India has something called the public distribution system, which is a government welfare scheme to provide cheap food to poor people. With this huge one, of course, is corruption is a huge problem, but also this problem that it's all rice and wheat taken from the so-called green revolution areas, and by the time it gets to people down on the ground, it's really bad quality. So what they've done is they've created a parallel public distribution system for the poor people in the village, where locally grown organic local millets and local rice varieties are available for the people. They've also gone well beyond agriculture and do community media. They make their own films, they run a community radio station, they run their own school, and so on and so forth. And it's an incredible transformation that you see there, which is not just a transformation in food sovereignty or controlling media, but also more fundamentally a transformation of their status as Dalits and women and small farmers, and that sort of demolishing the kind of traditional inequalities and exploitation that existed. Let's take water. Moving away from the paradigm of big dams and the paradigm of saying some places have not enough water, some places have too much water, and so we move from here to here. We actually start looking at alternatives such as, for instance, in Rajasthan in Western India, one of India's lowest rainfall areas, where several hundred villages have created water sovereignty or water self-sufficiency by making small-scale structures. Now, that's a technological innovation. That's important, but what to me is even more interesting is that for something like 10 to 12 years, they experimented with eco-regional planning, which is to say that they took over an entire river valley of 400 square kilometers, and 65 villages along the valley formed a parliament, a people's parliament, to discuss issues relating to not just water sharing, but also all other aspects of living in that valley, the conservation of forests, the disputes between villages, and so on and so forth. It's a very interesting experiment. It has become much weaker now for various reasons, but in the time it lasted, it provided lots of very interesting lessons of, and I'll come back to that, of cutting through traditional political boundaries and working at ecological or biological, biocultural regions. Let's take another example, which to me is it's one of my favorites, now widely cited in India for various reasons. This is a village in central India, an indigenous village, which about 30 years back was involved with a fight against big dams, and a successful fight where they stopped two very large hydroelectricity and irrigation projects. But in the process, they also actually got politicized to say that why don't we form decision-making processes that actually also democratize things that are happening in our own village. It's not just a fight against the state, we also have a fight against our own internal inequalities and other aspects. So they decided that all decisions in the village will be taken by consensus by the entire village assembly, which is the women, men and children, and that these decisions will be taken only when everybody agrees to it. Now, of course, there are issues there also which we can discuss. But they also formed a whole series of, and they keep forming, this is an ongoing process, study circles, so that they say that, okay, our own local traditional knowledge, if it's not adequate, we might call in somebody from outside and we put these knowledges together, and we then take that to the village assembly, and the assembly is able to take an informed decision. Through all of that, in the last few years, they've taken back control over forests that had in colonial times been taken away by the government and retained by the independent Indian state. They've taken back control over it and created full employment, energy security, food security, etc., using forest resources and their own agricultural resources. And the most interesting thing 3 years back is that all the private agricultural land of the community has been turned into commons. And I'll come back to this as an issue later on when we talk about economic transformation. And their slogan, which I'll use later on to talk about democracy, is that while we elect the government in Mumbai and Delhi, we are the government in our village. So in fact, they've been implementing this. Nobody else can take decisions in the village except the assembly itself. And we find similar things happening in other parts of the world. Some of you are more familiar with this than I am, so maybe in the discussions you can tell us more or raise issues about it. I'm not going to go through all of these, but there's many different initiatives on local self-governance, on building more self-sufficient communities, autonomous communities, which do not take the dictates of governments and corporations. Across the world, we also see this phenomenon of indigenous peoples and community conserved areas. According to us, possibly more area is covered by this than by so-called conventional protected areas, government protected areas. At least 12, 13, 15% of the world's surface covered by indigenous territories and community areas, which are managing to conserve the ecosystems and the wildlife and the biodiversity and their ways of life through this. Let's take jobs or a livelihood. The conventional market economy in India has not created any significant net new jobs. In the last 25 to 30 years, we needed 120 million more jobs, of which in the formal sector only about 3 million have been created. So it's what is called jobless growth. But there are initiatives which are actually showing how one can create or revive livelihoods which are dignified, which are which provide people adequate means of livelihood. So, for instance, there are now increasing numbers of farmers-producer companies, or producer companies, which could be farmers, fishing communities, craftspersons, etc., collectivizing their operations and being able to deal better with the market. There is still a market relationship, and there are dilemmas there, but nevertheless, at least in terms of being able to assert themselves and their status as producers, these are interesting initiatives. We find a women's collective up in the Himalaya, which started with working on domestic violence against women, and then also added on issues of livelihoods, of fighting against the local hydroelectricity project, and many other things. So essentially just the empowerment of women itself, using local resource-based livelihoods that provide, again, dignity and better status than was earlier the case. More and more we actually find that there are settlements that are beginning to challenge the conventional belief that inevitably there is going to be this mass migration from villages into cities, and that the world will be 80% urbanized in the next 10, 15, 20 years. These are just a few examples of many, still marginal, but nevertheless increasing, of villages which have actually not just stopped out migration, but where people who had gone out have come back in many cases, because they now find adequate, dignified sources of livelihood. And again, livelihood, I'm not only talking about economic jobs, I'm talking about ways of life. In cities, again, also we find some similar initiatives. The Homes in the City is an interesting program in Western India, where poor colonies, so-called slums in India, are finding ways of providing housing, dignified housing for themselves, water self-sufficiency, open spaces, civic amenities, etc. A lot of it self-provisioned, but a lot of it also just making sure that the government is accountable for what it is supposed to be doing. And building people's power to self-govern, to actually do decentralized or localized governance in cities also, at neighborhood and small-scale levels. And again, of course, there are many such examples in other parts of the world. We see that even the middle class, which normally tends to be very aloof and alienated from this kind of a process, in some places begins to also respond and react, whether it's through participatory budgeting, demanding that the budget for the city should be made at the local level and not by politicians and bureaucrats, or it's non-profit stores like many that you find in Europe, or it's revivals of urban ecosystems that have otherwise fallen into disuse or have been destroyed, and so on. I was a couple of months back in Thessaloniki in Greece and was lucky enough to go to Viome. Many of you might know it, the worker-led factory, worker-run factory producing eco-friendly cleaning agents. And that, so you can see actually that again this is happening now in more and more parts of the world, that the means of production are being taken back control over by producers themselves, not left to capitalists. And there are many other such examples of new economics or a more democratic economics being tried out. We move now to the sphere of knowledge. And one of the biggest problems to my mind has been the education system. In India, we inherited the British system of education. And in fact, some people say that there's a guy called Mr. Macaulay, who in the 19th century very cleverly actually predicted that the best way to colonize a nation is to colonize their minds. And the best way to colonize minds is to create an education system. So right from the time you're 5 years old, you're actually told that this is how you need to live. This is how society needs to be structured, etc., etc. And so we have an education system in India which actually creates enormous alienations from ecological roots, cultural roots, and basically enables the system to source more and more labor for its own needs. But we have counter trends. We have increasing number of alternative learning spaces where children are able to reconnect back with their ecological and cultural roots, but also learn what's happening in the rest of the world, be more open, be more tolerant, and so on, more caring, sharing, not competitive. One of the most, oh, by the way, I don't know how many of you know this, but the origin of the word school in Greek was skole, which means leisure. Worth remembering, if you look at the schools that we have these days. Some of the most interesting ones that we have recently looked at and experienced, these are shala. Shala means, roughly speaking, school, where traditional skills are taught by the elders who are not PhDs and so on, or just experts in their own field, to the new generation, but in ways that make it relevant for that new generation to also earn, to also be, get meaningful livelihoods through it. So it's not just an esoteric passing of skills, but is very meaningful for their lives. So there's many different things for crafts, for construction, for alternative water management, and so on and so forth. And then we also begin to find, of course, more democratic innovations of technology, or the availability of technologies which are more ecologically friendly, which are more pro-poor, and enable a more dignified living for those who otherwise don't have it in many different ways. I wish I had the time to actually explain each of these examples. They're fascinating. And finally, then, of course, also reclaiming the space of media, communications, and arts, which has otherwise been taken over by, the Trumps of the world. I hope that country doesn't get taken over by the Trumps of the world, but anyway. So, again, many examples. Let me just give you one which is very interesting, which is community radios. In India, there's now more than 150 community radios. These are run by communities themselves. They actually reach across to, in average, maybe 100 villages, 200 villages or settlements, and are able to convey local initiatives, local knowledge, local cultural practices to a very wide range of people. And there are many, many, many others. And again, we find stories of this from elsewhere. Anybody familiar with Cuba would know that, for instance, the research and development program in Cuba is not only within some expert, so-called expert institutions, but it's a public process. Okay, now the main meal. One can go on talking about and describing these sorts of initiatives from around the world. As I said, there are thousands, there are tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands if you look at it around the world. Do we actually discern some sort of a framework, some common elements which can provide us a possible vision for a future society which is very different from the one that we have right now? And I'm going to attempt to do that. For us, the learning from these initiatives with people who are part of these initiatives is not like an academic exercise, and I'll talk about the process at the end of how we do this. But the learnings is that there are at least 5 interconnected circles which are core to this transformation. And I'll talk about each one of these in a minute. Right now I just want to name them. There's ecology, there's democracy, political democracy, economic democracy, social justice, and cultural and knowledge diversity. And I'm hoping that the Olympics of 2050 will be about these 5 circles and not those 5 circles. It'll be more about cooperation than about competition. So, the dish that is brewing this morning is what we call eco-Swaraj, and explain Swaraj in a minute. It's a very simple concept that, and by the way, the meaning of radical, just like the meaning of school, because we tend to think of radical as being extreme. Actually, radical simply means going to the roots. But because you go to the roots, you also challenge the conventional. So the concept is simply that all of us are involved in decision-making processes. We don't leave it to politicians and bureaucrats and so on. We're all involved. We all have the power, the capacity, and the forums to actually be involved in decision-making processes. But that while we're doing it, we are also ecologically and socially responsible, which means issues of sustainability and resilience and equality and justice and so on are built into our decision-making processes. And it also means that the fulcrum of decision-making moves away from governments and corporations to communities. Now, those communities can be defined in many different ways. It could be an old village or an urban neighborhood. It could be a collective of degrowthers or alternativers or whatever. There are many different ways in which you can actually define collectives and communities. But decision-making is in those forums and not with corporations and the state. Why do I use the word eco-Swaraj? Swaraj, as you probably know, was a term that was popularized by Gandhi in the independence struggle. Unfortunately, because it was connected to the independence struggle, it has gotten to mean independent, a country independent of its colonial masters. That's really a superficial meaning of the word Swaraj. Swaraj actually means, when you say self-rule, it's really about from individuals to communities. It's about freedom, but freedom that is exercised in a way that is responsible to the other. So my freedom cannot come at the expense of your freedom, and our collective freedoms cannot come at the expense of the planet or other species. So it's a much deeper concept, which is politics, which is economics, which is spirit, which is culture and everything. And of course, this is not the only Indian concept. There are hundreds of such concepts which one can talk about. And then we find similar worldviews and concepts and frameworks from elsewhere. Yesterday, Edgardo, I think mentioned buen vivir, but of course it's a concept that you now increasingly know. I'm actually a little jealous about this. I don't know why buen vivir has become so well known in Europe and Swaraj has not. Okay, I'm joking. But, yeah, so, and these are really inspiring worldviews. Some of them are really ancient that are coming back as part of movements. Some of them are new, like, degrowth, etc. But you can see that actually people are trying to move beyond beyond the sort of normal conventional ways of looking at life and things, and trying to create or recreate and revive more holistic, more fundamental ways of looking at life. So, what is the recipe for transformational alternatives? Going back to the Olympics circles. A new politics to me, and when I say new, I don't necessarily mean that everything is completely new. I mean, some of it might be very old that's coming back, but the frameworks is about what the village said, our government in Mumbai and Delhi, but in our village, we are the government, which means direct democracy, radical democracy, deep democracy, different terms are used, where the locus of decision making starts at that grassroots bottom level, cities, villages, wherever you are. You can actually create more mature forms of direct democracy even at larger levels through things like referendums, not in the way referendums are done today, which is kind of mechanical, but of course we all need the capacity to be able to participate in them more maturely. And then building on that delegated or representative democracy, you can't do away with it, because obviously at very large levels you have to have people who are representing you. But the power of those is emanating from the bottom, and it's not the other way around, where there are mechanisms of accountability, including things like right to recall and so on. And then finally also, and this is what I think is really exciting and relatively new, is sort of beginning to question current political boundaries from ecological and cultural standpoints. And how do we actually think of decision making at levels that make ecological sense, such as the Arvari River Parliament that I spoke about earlier. And which also then means, are we then talking about a borderless world, as in nation state boundaries break down? And then what would be the new, not boundaries, but what would be the new units of decision making? How do they sort of relate to each other? These are all matters of a lot of exploration, a lot of discussion that has to happen. Obviously, conditions for any of this to work well is that we have the, like I said, the rights, capacity and forums, but also the maturity, because often what tends to happen is that if the democracy is not mature enough, you get into issues of the majority not listening to the minority and people saying, okay, you stay out, this is only for me, etc., sort of more closed, xenophobic kind of politics that could come in even into direct democracy. So those are dangers we have to look at. The second ingredient, economics. Okay, this is a bit of a clever play of words. Shastra in India means study. So, Arthashastra, which in Hindi means economics. Economics as if the earth, including all of us, mattered. What would this look like? First, of course, economics that's mindful of planetary limits. Economy as part of ecology rather than the other way around. I think it was Satish Kumar, the editor of Resurgence, who was telling me a story from when he went about 15-20 years back to the London School of Economics. And he asked them, where is your School of Ecology? And they were saying, what? School of Ecology in a London School of Economics? That makes no sense. And then he told them, actually, you should be a London School of Ecology within which there should be economics. But anyway, that's a bit of a stretch. So, localization, but clearly not falling for the dangers of a xenophobic anti-outsider localization, but a much more open one. But to say that at least for basic needs, we do not need to depend on somebody 3,000 miles away for food, for water, for health, for education, etc. These are things that we can actually be creating in our own local bio regions, and then continue to have trade. It's not like we're closing ourselves off from everybody else, but the trade is built on that localization. The merging of production and consumption. I don't know why we have this. We have now created this division between you're a producer, I am a consumer. And we're all, or could be, prosumers. What did Marx say? He said, I can be a farmer in the morning, a critic in the evening, and a cook in the night, or whatever. I mean, there's some 5-6 things that he said. Which we actually can. I mean, all of us as human beings have the capacity to be multiple things, which are both producers and consumers. And an issue that I mentioned yesterday in response to a question, that why don't we actually start building a sustainable consumption line and creating the social processes by which if anybody is above the sustainable consumption line, everybody looks at that person with, what? Really? How can you be? It's like, smokers in an airport, confined to that little tiny box. Anybody who is over consuming could possibly also have that tiny, okay, I'm sorry if there are any smokers in the room, but we need to create those. So this is not about a government imposing a sustainable consumption line, no, but just building the processes by which we can actually start looking at each other using consumption as one matrix. Reintegrating work and leisure. Like I mentioned right at the beginning, we've actually moved from livelihoods to jobs. How do we actually move back? How do we demolish? I think yesterday in the question somebody had said this. If I'm enjoying my work, why do I need a separate fun time or leisure time, right? So you actually start, I think there are some communities who actually don't even have different words for work and leisure. How do we actually do that, moving back from what modernity has given us, this division? Recommoning the private, like the village has done with its agricultural land. And this is, of course, I know it's a holy cow, but for people in this room, I'm sure, I hope it is not, but moving away from private property and recommoning it. And then, of course, demonetization or the decentralization of currencies, moving away from the hegemony, right, of money. I don't know if you've ever noticed that interesting thing, hegemony. So, how do we actually create or bring back relations of caring and sharing and exchange which are not necessarily based on money, or if they are, they're based on local currencies, as is being experimented in many parts of the world. The third ingredient, justice. And I don't think this is something I need to go into in any great detail. We do have serious inequalities of all kinds across the world. And of course, they have to be tackled. We have to move towards systems where equality becomes the norm or equity becomes the norm and not inequality. Which can be rights-based approaches, but rights with responsibilities. We have a tendency, at least in India, to keep fighting for rights, but we have to understand that those have to come with the responsibilities. Swaraj, again, that my freedom can only be if I'm also respecting your freedom. So the concept of Sarvodaya, which is everybody's being lifted up or is rising to full human potential together. Fourth ingredient, knowledge, culture. India has 800 living languages. These are not dialects, they're full languages. So somebody sometimes says, okay, you're in India. I mean, like you get a South Indian coming up to me and starting, they will know, but then they say, okay, I'll speak in Tamil to you, and I'll say, I'm sorry, I don't understand that language at all. It's a completely different root. There are like 3 different roots of languages in India, the 800 living languages, which is actually an incredible resource. I mean, a linguist recently told me that in northern India, in the state of Himachal Pradesh, there are 320 terms for snow. When it falls, how it falls, where it falls on, what is the size of the snowflake, how fast it melts, everything has a different term. Now imagine that knowledge being used for dealing with climate change. And imagine if English is taught or Hindi is taught in all the schools, and in the next generation you lose all those terminologies and the knowledge that goes with that. So the importance of cultural diversity, which is not just language, of course, but all sorts of other things. The importance of democratizing knowledge, whether it's modern science and technology, or it's so-called traditional sciences and knowledge, or any of the other forms of knowledge. The importance of recommoning the media and arts, and recreating opportunities for personal spiritual enlightenment and growth, not falling into the traps, of course, of mainstream orthodox religions. And this means then that we're talking about an alternative globalization. It's actually globalization that's happened for the last 5,000, 6,000 years. We have exchanged all kinds of things. If you grow mango in Brazil, it came from India. Indians' food is known to be spicy food. Those spices came from Mexico. When I talk to younger generations in India today, they don't believe it. They say, no, this is Indian. Spices are Indian. Chilies are Indian. They're not. They're from Mexico. So we've had exchanges of cultures and materials for a long time. That's globalization, and that's fine. And I think we need to continue that or even build on it. What we don't want is the financial and economic globalization or the mental globalization that we have one path of development or one path of what it means to have a good life. Fifth ingredient, of course, is a renewed relationship with nature, in which we recognize that we're part of nature and not separate from it. And of course, we respect other species and respect nature in all its incredible complexity and diversity. So, of course, we have 5 ingredients, but they're not going to be cooking unless there is a medium. In India, we use too much oil, so I'm not going to mention oil. It could be any cooking media. Maybe olive oil, because that's not so harmful. What is this? To me, actually, this is the most important thing, which is values and principles. And I'm just going to put them up here and not sort of really discuss them, because each of these will take its own time. But it seems to me that the alliances, the commonalities that we are able to build with each other across the world, cutting across the incredible cultural and ecological and political and economic differences or diversity, is at the level of these values. And this is a set of values, a very initial set of values which one can then contrast to the one that dominant economy and dominant polity is talking to us. So it's collective versus individualism, the commons versus the private, diversity versus homogeneity, and so on. Happiness not about buying a 40-inch color television set, but about being able to relate like this to each other and sit in the evenings and talk and not have coffee time in which we're all staring at our screens. You've all seen those pictures, right? People having coffee together and basically just talking to their screens, mobile screens or whatever. So I'm just going to put this up there, and maybe an interesting exercise for a minute. Close your eyes, open them, and go straight to any one of them. And then in the discussion time, maybe we can talk about, if you think you want to talk about any of these values. Right. Coffee time. Sit back and let's ponder over questions that we need lots of dialogue, lots of resolution, lots of answers for. Is there going to be a state at all in such a future of radical ecological democracy? If so, what would be its role? What can we think of global governance? United Nations is nation states. So if we say that's not acceptable, what could be a people's global governance? What could it look like? Would there be any business sector left, private or otherwise? And if so, are we talking about profits? Are we talking about revenues that get channelized back into social purposes? How do all these thousands of initiatives across the world actually begin to network and come together to force the larger changes in the structural changes that we want? Okay, the Microsoft, which is what many of us are involved with, versus the macro hard, which is that dominant economy. There's no pun intended here, by the way. Who will be the agents of change? NGOs? Probably not. Mass movements? Okay, how do they get together? Political parties? Probably not. Workers' unions? Probably part of the answer. Who else? Academics? Students? Young people? Who will be the agents of change, or multiple agents of change, and how do we get together? How do we rethink epistemologies? How do we actually create space for multiple ways of looking at the world, for different worldviews, moving away from the domination of a Western mode of thinking and doing, including things like time. A colleague from India who's going to talk about it later today was just mentioning about time itself. And yesterday evening I was also saying we're talking about linear time versus circular time. So many different ways to look at epistemologies. And finally, I think this is something that Clive also mentioned. What do we look at? Individual freedoms, which is so crucial to us as part of collectives. What is that balance that we want? So the last couple of minutes, this is the dessert. It's a process that we've started in India called Vikalp Sangam, which means alternatives confluences, not a conference. So we don't sit like this and, I bore you for 1 hour and then, you have a few minutes for questions. We actually sit in a circle and talk and do joint activities and so on. The idea is, how does one actually, the people who are working on politics, who are working on economics, who are working on energy, who are working on transportation, who are working on gender, who are working on food, who are working on water, how do we talk to each other? Who are doing brilliant alternative stuff on all of this, but are not really getting together, how do they talk to each other? How do we build alliances, cooperation, teach each other, constructively criticize each other, and from all of that, also do a joint visioning process. So we've done several of these across India. India is actually a bit like Europe in the sense, for historical accidental reasons, it's one country, but it could be 30 or 30 peoples or 500 peoples or whatever. So it's not possible to do a national level. We've been doing it across the different parts of the country and also on thematic levels that you can see the list over there. Next month, if any of you happens to be in southern India, you're most welcome to a food alternatives confluence. There'll be great food there, but also talk about alternative food politics and diversity and cultures and so on and so forth. And through all of that, to actually vision a common future, not, which can pick from Marx and it can pick from Gandhi and it can pick from Ambedkar and Trotsky and whoever else, but it also emanates from the experience, the live experience and the generations of wisdom of people from the ground, so that we don't get stuck in a Marxist scenario or a Gandhian scenario or whatever it is. So this is a visioning process that's been happening through this. There's a note called The Search for Alternatives. I'd be happy to share it. It's also on our website for you if you want to look at it, which goes into principles and values and elements and strategies and so on. There's also a website as part of this process, which documents several hundred stories of hope and inspiration. This is from India. We have about 400 stories already up there in the last 2 years, and many more are coming in. And of course, I'm aware of the fact that there are also global level mapping processes or documentation processes of these kinds of initiatives. So, here's a wild idea. How about a global alternatives forum? Not a global degrowth forum, but a global alternatives forum in which there's degrowth, there's Boen Vive, there's Swaraj, there's commons, there's all kinds of stuff happening. Any volunteers to organize it? Seriously, we should think about this. Finally then, we often get charged with this. People will stand up and say, oh come on, this is a utopia. I mean, why are you dreaming? It's never going to happen. In the book that a colleague and I did, which has 300 pages of bad news of what globalization has done to India and 100 pages of alternatives, that's a beginning, and we'll write more. I have a couple of copies if somebody is interested, and I also have an extreme summary of the book, which is only 20 pages, and it's got pictures, if you don't want to read 400 pages. But in this book, at the end we say, we address this question of an impossible utopia. And what we say is the following, that between these seemingly impossible paths and the obviously insane one of unending growth, we prefer the former. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashish. Well, we loved your talk. Thank you. It was really, really inspiring. I mean, all these alternatives happening in India and the way you have analyzed all these elements for transformation across all these alternatives, worldviews, and all your ideas for carrying on. I loved your idea of the Global Alternatives Forum. So yeah, let's open the floor for comments, questions. I'm sure that you had a slide with great questions. I don't know if you want to come back to that, but I think it would be a good start. Yeah, really.
Ja, Volker Maurer, University of Vienna, Austria. Thank you for a really inspiring, wonderful kaleidoscope of ideas, of concrete examples and visions. I would come back to your sustainable consumption line and issue the population question also together with this, yes, because the sustainable consumption line is also an issue of per capita, yeah? And the per capita can rise or sink. And so what is your ideas about the connection between the sustainable consumption line and the population question? And a short issue in own things, I displayed yesterday outside a book. It's on legal aspects of sustainable developments, and it disappeared. So if somebody has seen walking it away, please let me know, and I would be happy to get it again. I'd go to other conferences to display it. Thank you. And by the way, we have a session in the afternoon on legal aspects of degrowth, room 326. Thank you.
We will get a couple more questions. The green.
Thank you. My name is Lanka. I'm from the Seed Freedom campaign in Portugal, part of the global Seed Freedom movement. And my question for you is probably very obvious for you, but I'd love to hear your view, and probably the people here as well. In my research of the food system, reading especially discourses on food politics, I found that there's one limit that capitalists and especially neoliberals will place, that they will not go beyond, and it has to do with everything that's called self-something. And I've read quite a lot of reports, and some of them, especially UK, Australia, USA, World Bank, OECD, and of course World Trade Organization, they actually don't even hide it. They specifically say that they frown upon food self-sufficiency. They do not want to see these kind of initiatives. They will allow you to do some organic things and a bit of agroecology on the side, you know, maybe make the poorest people less poor, but don't go too far. Anything that's self-sufficiency at a larger scale, they will react. I don't know exactly how yet, but I know they will react, and I'd like to hear your view on this.
Gareth back there.
Good morning. Thank you, Ashish, for this great talk. I have a question or a concern. You proposed the Global Alternatives Forum, already some indicated to volunteer for such a forum, but we had such a forum for more than 10 years. And one was in India in 2004, the World Social Forum. And it didn't work, I would say. And my counter hypothesis would be a little bit that we are in a situation to regionalize, to look more at the region and to condense the struggles at the regional level without, this was the key message from last night, I hope you got it, without denying and forgetting what's happening elsewhere. But in Europe, we need also these kind of conversions, of discussions. And the other proposal is, or let's say the conclusion out of the World Social Forum, not to have such a global alternatives forum for all the struggles, but to have within the specific spheres. I know it's difficult to compartmentalize, but at the end of the last World Social Forum, we had always more than 20 working groups on water, land, seeds, feminist issues, and so on. And maybe we are in a situation to bring together these kind of alternative experiences in order to avoid the trap to have another big attempt with all the money, with all the effort, and to reproduce the experience of the World Social Forum, which was great for 10 years, but then please let us know your evaluation why it collapsed, kind of.
I think we collect one more question, Miriam, here, and then we will let Ashish answer.
Thanks. Miriam Lang from Ecuador, from Germany but living in Ecuador. I would like to introduce a little bit of our debates about the rights of nature we have had and which also entered the Constitution, because that supposes that you establish rights for non-human entities. And the background is a little bit that we are having increasingly rights for non-human entities like corporations that effectively have rights and not so many responsibilities, right? Because this suddenly is voluntary and not binding. And so in our discussions, the necessary correspondence between rights and responsibilities when we talk of the rights of nature is not working. And even if you think of some human groups that simply are not able, because of some condition, to have responsibilities, I think we could introduce the possibility of permeability on the margins of this correspondence between rights and responsibilities. And then I wanted to introduce the greed line as a concept, which is very similar to the sustainable consumption line, like in the way of not problematizing so much poverty, but problematizing billionaires and just shifting the focus on that the problem is being rich and not being poor. And there are some scholars pushing this concept of the greed line, which could be made productive.
Thank you. Okay, in the interests of time and getting maybe more comments and questions, I'll try and be brief. Well, there were 2 points on the sustainable consumption line. The greed line, great. I mean, it would be fantastic if we could do something like that. Maybe together, sustainable consumption line. Sustainable consumption line, I guess, is a more positive way of addressing it. A greed line is like exposing the greed, let's say. So I think both have their own value. In terms of the per capita thing, I think I guess the idea is that over a period of time, if all of this goes together, so a sustainable consumption line cannot go individually apart from the other transformations that need to take place. If that happens, we actually will see a stabilization of population anyway. I mean, that seems to be the prediction that most people are making, demographers, that if you actually go in that direction, you will see a stabilization of population. So to me, actually, demography and population is not a big issue. This came up in the yesterday evening's session also, I know. What is a much bigger issue is the levels of consumption of each person. And in that also, incidentally, I think it's very important to say that it's not about equal consumption, because different kinds of people do have different needs. So we also need to be aware of the diversity of needs, even as we talk about equalizing consumption. But I don't think that so population currently may or may not be an issue. I don't know, that's a very complex issue, but I think in the future, if we're talking about a fundamental transformation, it, to my mind, is not an issue. Self, that is definitely a no-no for the neoliberal economy or for even for states. I mean, nobody, if you are currently powerful, if I am currently powerful, I don't want you to become self-powerful, obviously, because then you're not dependent on me anymore. A couple of quick points. I think one of the reasons why, self-sufficiency is still something that is used. I mean, in India, the state has often used that word, self-sufficiency, but in the sense of India being self-sufficient on, let's say, food grains. But they will never talk about food sovereignty or self-sovereignty or self-autonomy, because that is really then taking the power away even from the state. Whereas if you talk about national self-sufficiency, the state still has the power. So I think one has to be a little bit nuanced on that. But yes, the more sovereignty movements expand and become more powerful, the system will hit back, if that's the point you're making, absolutely. And that's why we need the networks and the support systems amongst ourselves to make these alternatives more resilient. Uli, yes, I actually forgot to mention it when I put up that slide, that there is the question of whether the World Social Forum can or still provides a forum of this kind for alternatives. My feeling, and I've only been to one or two, is that there is so much of a focus even now on exposing, on the bad news. And there needs to be, of course, continuing exposure on the bad news, that there isn't adequate attention within the World Social Forum on alternatives. That's my feeling. I may be wrong, and I think this is something we need to discuss. I totally go with you that we need to have, much more important than a global forum would be regional forums, would be local forums, would be national, until nations exist, national forums. And that these need to be aware of and sensitive to other things happening in the rest of the world. But I do think that there is a function for, maybe it's once in 5 years or once in 10 years, I don't know, where we're able to actually get a lot more people from across the world together. Maybe these are sort of democratically nominated from each of the regional, local, national forums into a global one. I don't know how that process would work. But something where the focus essentially is, we say, okay, the first session, let's get past the bashing the system, we need to do that, let's do it. The rest of the forum, let's focus on what are the fantastic alternatives that are coming up around the world and how do we build more alliances amongst those. But also specific sectoral forums, yes, water, agriculture, governance, etc., that also. So I think we can think of a whole variety of different kinds of these forums. And we can also think of virtual forums. I mean, I'm not much of a fan of the virtual world, but it does provide us an opportunity of actually having 500 people across the world meeting together, but not physically. There is, in fact, I think in October, there's going to be a global, what will the world look like in 2050? A global forum of that kind. And nobody is physically meeting. It's happening from wherever you are on Earth. You can actually link up and make presentations and ask questions and so on. So there are many possibilities for that. Miriam, rights of nature and responsibilities. Yeah, I think to me, the responsibility part of it is, if we are talking about a world in which there are some who are marginalized and disprivileged and cannot actually fulfill that responsibility, we're talking about more collective ways of then fulfilling that responsibility. Where those of us who can, or who can help that community or that set of workers or whoever it is, we actually work together and say, okay, how do we, while we respect the rights of nature, how do we fulfill our responsibilities towards conserving the rest of nature? And I think that's how we'll have to work at it. If we look at it either as individuals or as small communities, it creates the problems that you're talking about. So if that's what you meant by permeability, then yes, I totally agree.
Long hair.
Philippe from France, can you say a few words about the Ekta Parishad movement? They are planning a big march and a campaign in 2020, which is called Jai Jagat 2020. Maybe there are some links between this movement and degrowth. And can you put again the 5 non-Olympic circles on the wall, please?
Right in the middle with long hair, yeah. Sorry?
Glenn Smith from the British education system that you so accurately described, unfortunately. Thank you for inspiring us all, first of all. One thing that I find interesting about your model is it's really tied together by the slide with the values and the principles. And potentially the model can be misused with other values and principles, for example, perhaps to build a form of radical, direct, deep dictatorship on a local level. How do you see the values and principles being upheld to prevent that? And is that perhaps where the state fits in?
Thank you. Now,
Sorry, can you just explain in a line what you mean by radical dictatorship?
Sure. Well, the model of building up community structures based on local values, if they are negative values, I mean, this whole idea, this wonderful idea is based on the values that a lot of us here share. But there's a danger that parts of it can be misused if people have different values as well. So building up kind of localized forms of tyranny and oppression is a danger that the model, I think, could come under. And if there is still a role for a state, perhaps it is to, you know, to make sure the values and principles are upheld.
this lady in black, this side, Lydia.
Thank you, Kerstin Wüdra from University of Applied Sciences, Erfurt. I had a very similar question. You mentioned shortly the word danger when you talked about direct democracy. And what are your experiences and thoughts if it is misused? Because we are observing this in Germany, or say much in Eastern Germany, right-wing people who take over these buzzwords and activities and would close their communities to not migrants, to refugees, to anybody, or people who you would use it for, maybe in India, for religious or nationalism, or even against renewable energies, or against wind energy in our community, against power lines for our renewable energy. So this also is, can be the result of direct democracy. What are your thoughts about it?
Yeah, I like that question, actually. I wanted, just next to the lady, yeah.
My name is Lawrence Davis from University College Cork in Ireland. And my question is, first to say, just thank you again, other people have said this, for a very rich presentation, wide-ranging, and I almost feel like I need more time to digest all the ideas. But my question concerns what seems to me, maybe continuing with this metaphor of a meal, a slight mismatch between the main course and the appetizer and the dessert and the coffee course. Because if you look at the very radical examples which are given in the starter, the appetizer course, and then in the coffee course, you talk about the questions concerning the abolition of the state, the abolition of markets, you talk about utopian vision after that. But in the main course, you talk about restructuring of markets, and you talk about a democratization of the state. And I'm just wondering why, when you're developing your ideas, your institutional proposals, why not think very radically about supersession of the state, overcoming of profit markets? And I take the point which has just been made, there are obviously need for coordinating mechanisms between communities for various reasons, but would that have to be a state form?
I'm going to fit in one more question and then we probably have to close. The lady in white, yeah.
Yeah, I've got a question about issues like respect for cultural diversity and like gender equality. So there might be a tension between those. And what is your experience with that in India?
Thank you. Okay, I wish I had another hour. These are really fascinating and very, very important questions. Felipe, Ekta Parishad, yes. For those of you who don't know, Ekta Parishad is a land rights movement, land and resource rights movement, which started in central India with indigenous peoples and other marginalized section, is now more national. And in fact is having a march. The march you're talking about is the one that's happening in Europe, right? There's actually, So they've also become more global. It's a very interesting movement of people who are struggling for the rights of survival in that sense, land, water, forest, and so on. They're very much part of the Vikalp Sangam process, which I mentioned, the process of trying to get confluences together, because they also recognize that even as you struggle for rights of land and so on, supposing you achieve those land rights, what then? What's the next step of actually getting to, let's say, sustainable agriculture or sustainable livelihoods and so on? And so we're trying to kind of, in that sense, work together to create a more holistic vision of rights and, struggles for resistance and rights along with alternative ways of living. So it's like, or reviving old ways of living which might still be sustainable. So we're very much in conversation and dialogue on that. Glenn and Kirsten was the name? Yes. And actually even the issue of cultural diversity and gender. All of the processes that I spoke about have these dangers. They have the dangers of elite capture, which I think Glenn you spoke about, and I like that term, radical deep dictatorship. I hadn't thought of that. They have the dangers of continuing inequalities from the past, which could be gender, and certainly many parts of India that is a very serious issue. They could be the dangers of becoming closed, xenophobic, intolerant towards the other, outsiders, etc., etc. All those dangers exist, which is why, to my mind, two things. One, all these 5 circles have to go together. If we try and focus only on one, there is a possibility that another one might actually get violated or undermined. I mean, for instance, we could move to deep democracy, truly deep democracy, but the community decides to cut down the entire forest, and that has a significant impact on the downstream community. So, because it's not built ecological resilience and wisdom into its functioning. So, we have to figure out ways in which we can, and this is the conversation that happens in part of our Sangams also, the confluences, is where we're able to constructively challenge each other and say, oh, you've done fantastic work on gender justice, but why don't you take environment into account? Or you've done incredible work on X, but you've not looked at Y. And maybe I can work with you where we can actually work on this together. And that then brings in the role of, to my mind, first of all, the role of civil society. And I'm using the word civil society in a very broad sense. The role of networks of people like us who can help communities in this transition, in this transformation. For instance, with the issue of women. Now, women are traditionally not, even in indigenous societies in India, traditionally decision making is still with the men, even though there's much more equality in the indigenous societies, communities than in others. But so there's a dialogue that gets worked out where civil society organizations working with them on various aspects actually begin to say, well, is this an issue? Do you think it's an issue? It's not an imposition. It's not saying you have to have this X, Y, Z, but it's a dialogue, and you begin to see that over a few years or over a generation, changes then begin to take place where, whether it's Dalits or it's women or it's landless or whoever has been marginalized, they start getting slowly empowered. And in this, the role of the state, yes, and I think that at least in the near future, there is a crucial role for a state for guaranteeing rights. The problem, at least from India that we know of, is that the state normally tends to go to side with those who are violating the rights rather than those who would guarantee the rights. And so then you have to continuously question the role of the state. But it should be playing that role. It should be actually assisting women or landless or Adivasis or whatever to be part of the decision-making process and to be part of economic processes. It doesn't do that. So then Lawrence's question about the role of the state and market. Two quick points. Both the state and the market, the definitions that we've used right now are extremely narrow definitions. We have equated the state with the nation state. And we've equated the market with the capitalist market. Where's Rajni? Rajni here has written a very interesting book on bazaars, conversations and freedom. Is that the right title? Yes. Which actually traces back the history of markets and bazaars. They've been there for 3,000 years, maybe more. Ever since humans were trading in anything, they've been there. So why can't we actually revive or recreate or create new forms of markets or bazaars which are places of exchange, which are not capitalist, which are not captured by capitalist forces, which are places of exchange where you can, maybe there's some money involved, maybe there's barter, maybe there's different forms of exchanges. So I meant it more in that sense than in the sense of the capitalist market. And the same with the state. The state is a form of governance. So if you were to actually talk about governance across larger scales and across all the way to the globe, you can possibly think about people-led democratic state. I know it's a kind of a twist of the word itself, but if you look at the original meaning of the word state, it's a form of governance. It is not necessarily an elite capture or a nation state kind of thing. So I think that's one uses. And then I think I also have to admit that these are all, even in the processes we're doing, these are all evolutionary things that are happening. So I think we're also all clarifying our own concepts and thoughts and so on about what would be an ideal situation or situations, frameworks and visions, but also the transitions towards that where we might still have to continue working with some forms of the current system. We can't sort of jump right from here to there immediately. So what is this tension between that ideal or ideals and the sort of transitionary forms in which a little bit of working with the system, against the system, is a combination of that takes place. But I think we need to redefine also the terms in many ways.
Great, thank you. So we don't have time for more, but it's a shame we have him here. So just come and talk to him after the end of the talk. He's here several days, so please approach him. Big applause for him, please.